Um, well, there's so much loss been expressed this evening, and I hope that this helps relieve that somewhat. Um, you know how a word can pop into your head and it just keeps nudging you, and that becomes your anchor point for meditation for a while. And for me, it's been virtue and equanimity, mainly because I've experienced so much the opposite of it in the past year. So I just wanted to share a few thoughts about how I've been practicing with these mantras since I'll call him the ex walked out of prison last year and walked out on me with such a premeditated harmfulness after 12 years of activism together and 6 years of marriage. But I talked about that last time, so I'm not going into that. Just to offer some thoughts about what virtue has come to mean to me, and equanimity in the face of deep suffering, which we had some experience of that this evening. So I'm going to start with the third noble truth, which is the Eightfold Path, and it's often divided into three fields of training. The first is the practices of sila, or ethical conduct, the practices of samadhi, which are deepening meditative states, and the practice of panir, or wisdom. So for me, actually, virtue underlies each step of the Eightfold Path because all the mind states are connected. But I want to focus on sila, or virtue, this evening. In Buddhism, virtue is seen as non-harming, and it's the foundation for developing wisdom, compassion, generosity, and equanimity. It's like moral integrity, which draws its source from metta, or universal goodwill. But for me, it's become especially right understanding of the law of karma, which basically says that all actions have consequences. That is, that all actions that are attached to something, mostly to craving or aversion, have conditions, and all conditions must bear fruit, which is karma, and that's the law. So this notion of virtue, or sila, came into my life back in 2015 when I first met Warden Muniz at Salinas Valley. I was advocating for several of the men, including the ex, who were part of our victorious class action suit, the Ashker settlement, which we won against the department. And this victory changed how the SHU system and gang validation and indefinite prolonged confinement, it eliminated the indefinite part. But it mandated the release into general population more than 1,500 individuals who had spent 10 to 40 years in the SHU. And the X was the 79th longest held after 21 years. So these men had been transferred to Salinas, half a dozen of them, but they had landed in ADSEG instead. So I jumped into action with emails back and forth with the warden, and he asked me to trust his word, which was interesting, and his word was good. And I experienced integrity for the first time from that side in the department. And so after 10 days, when the men were finally released to GP, Warden Muniz said that my actions had been virtuous, and he invited me into the Inmate Family Council. I had no idea what he meant, but I knew it mattered in his very good Christian ethic. So that's been in my heart and on my mind all these years. The Buddha said that one of the best ways to cultivate joy and happiness is to live a virtuous life. It's not like the 10 Commandments, where good deeds are rewarded in heaven and bad deeds are punished in hell. But instead, in Buddhism, virtue is based on the observation that some actions lead to suffering and others lead to happiness and freedom. It's not a judgment call. It's a process and a practice of mindful awareness and devotion to truth. So a Buddhist practitioner would ask, does this action or thought lead to increased suffering or to increased happiness for myself and for others? This is right understanding of what causes harm, which is the opposite of virtue and precludes equanimity. This also underlies the law of karma, that we ourselves inherit the fruits of our own actions, past, present, and future. So what a person does, that's his or her own karma, but our reaction to those acts, that's our karma. And it's karma that keeps us reincarnating on the wheel of suffering. So the Eightfold Path to Freedom, as I've been studying it and experiencing, teaches the value of seeing things as they are, which is an aspect of right view, that every form is impermanent, that whatever arises has the nature to pass away, period. And in a sense, it's that simple. So this kind of seeing, as they say, with unclouded eyes, leads to allowing things as they are, which to me leads to equanimity, or the ability to stay grounded in our being rather than to anything outside that's impermanent, which breeds illusion or Maya. So virtue helps us cultivate a stable peace of mind that isn't pulled off center by distractions, even of comfort and ease, let alone pain and disappointment. So these past few months, I've really been aware of change and how much we create so much of our own suffering because of how the mind clings to or avoids certain thoughts and beliefs. So the virtue of right understanding of the law of karma has been teaching me that everything unfolds lawfully, that there are no errors, and that impermanence is the Dharma. It is the law. So I think that virtue is the courage to train in each of the 8 steps, one by one and all together, and the willingness to stay with whatever arises in meditation and in our daily lives without our personal conditions placed on them. And so that leads to equanimity, which is allowing things to be as they are and resting in that dynamic state of flow or awareness. It's training in peace of mind and an open heart, in letting go, not so much of a person or loved one as one's identity with certain beliefs and thoughts, even in our desire to be comfortable, when in truth there is nowhere to stand because things are impermanent. So I feel that when we virtuously and honestly examine the nature of form and formlessness, including human nature, we see that everything is arising and dissolving, as in Newt's meditation with the breath. And for me, equanimity arises when we can stay balanced within that truth of change, when we can keep our hearts open and our minds pure. And it actually happens by itself. We don't have to do anything to create it. And it works. It really does. So I'm realizing that, and very gratefully, that the cessation of suffering over this chapter of my life has been in recognizing and allowing the dissolution of solid thoughts, the thoughts of how I wanted things to be, how I thought things were and would always be, just because we had said so. The Buddha said that uncompromising freedom is not dependent on any conditions at all. So I've had to face the inconvenient truth that I had indeed solidified my thoughts around grasping the future and clinging to desired outcomes and clinging to what I thought would happen, what I wanted to happen. And that created a lot of suffering. So I've been also listening to a lot of the wonderful Buddhist teacher, Joseph Goldstein, and he said in a discussion about the 5 precepts, he said, following the training rules offers us a powerful form of protection. Primarily, the precepts protect us from ourselves, from the suffering we cause others and ourselves when we act unskillfully. The fundamental principles that underlie all 5 precepts are compassion, not causing harm, and generosity. He says we follow the precepts out of compassion, out of the sense of the suffering of others, and out of the possibility that others can be free of suffering. We also live by the precepts out of compassion for ourselves. We want to be careful about our intentions in our actions, how we act, how we speak, even the kinds of thoughts that we pursue. And he says, then a natural organic generosity arises, not from thought or social mandate, but from the equanimous place in an open heart and a peaceful mind. It is a place where we are not dependent on or addicted to anything or anyone external to be in the space of love, the place of our being. So to me, this is the practice of virtue, of sila, and the virtue that leads to equanimity. Because as the Buddha said, awakening into freedom from suffering is more difficult than overcoming 1,000 warriors 1,000 different times, single-handedly. So it's been an interesting process to come back around 8 years later, 7 years later, to what the warden said to me. I kind of always avoided thinking about virtue, but because I became so aware of the litany of unwholesome acts which were perpetrated upon me and so many others by him, I really wanted to dive deep. And it's been painful and it's been illuminating, but it's been worth it. And that's why I say the practice really works. So I want to close with a quote from the great Sufi master Hazrat Inayat Khan, who said, "The lover that leans upon the beloved's response, his love is like the flame that needs oil to live. But the lover who stands on her own feet is like the lantern of the sun that burns without oil." And I'd like to read that again. The lover that leans upon the beloved's response, his love is like the flame that needs oil to live. But the lover who stands on her own feet is like the lantern of the sun that burns without oil. So to me, that fairly summarizes a practice of virtue that leads to equanimity, that leads to an unconditional kind of being love rather than being in love, that we cultivate that within our hearts and a more purified mind through the suffering and through the grace of suffering, which I still feel. So so that's really, I didn't want to go on at length about it. I just wanted to offer these and offer it up for discussion. We have quite a bit of time, actually. So I thought that we might just keep it in the group. If everyone wants to break into small groups, that's fine. But I just thought it might be a really interesting and valuable discussion. And I'd like to hear what everybody has to say, especially in the context of what of the prison system and the cages and what we've talked about and the transformation that those of you who've come home, to me, that is the deepest expression of virtue. So I have a short meta offering at the end to close if we have time, but that's really what I have to say. So thank you all for listening.